Hello everyone. Welcome to another webinar promoted by SoftExpert. Today's event presents where to start with daily process improvement. The webinar will be conducted by Mr. Byrne, Director Consultant at Process Management International Limited, PMI. Barry has led client interventions for PMI on a global scale, facilitating improvement initiatives that have resulted in large financial savings. I wish you all a great webinar.
Rich, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for the introduction and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk with you on the approach to improvement, most often called daily process management, DPM. And that age-old question of where do I begin? Now, I suppose that's probably a song in there somewhere, Rich, but perhaps you're not as old as me. But there are also some other questions, of course. For example, so what are the sort of habits I would see, and what are the rhythms of the way we work and how the work works? And I'm sure and I hope that you'll have some more questions for me this afternoon. So as Richard said, in this first of two webinars on DPM, I'm going to focus on what good actually looks like, and specifically the role of a top manager in deploying daily process management. Now we'll look at each of the roles through the hierarchy of processes, but essentially it's important that we understand the role of the top manager, those that we see as our CEOs, heads of functions and so forth. I'm going to use a story to illustrate the very real challenge we see and appreciate when we're working with clients. In addition to that, I think it's important then that recognizing that challenge is, so what's our theory for management, and specifically what's our theory, PMI's theory for DPM, daily process management. And finally then I want to look at the process that we use in order to put that theory into practice so that we are in control every day. I'll describe the identification, definition and deployment of the vital tools necessary to enable DPM through our process management improvement cycle, which is standardize, maintain, and improve. So more about that next week. But for today, I'm going to offer you an approach that's underpinned by principle, by method, and by tools. And I'll also set out the end game. So what does good look like? And specifically, what will we see happening at each of the hierarchical levels in a business that has adopted DPM as its way of working? I'm going to tell you a story, and it's a true story, and it's a journey of one of the clients that I met some years back. Now, names have changed to protect the innocent, of course, but I think it's useful to listen to this story and to compare that end game with the reality of life as it is today for many of you. I'm going to use this story to illustrate the challenges we see in embedding DPM, and in this particular case, in Dave's story, the exit route from the chaos he found himself in that enabled this client to gain control of and ultimately grow its business. So let me start by laying out the case. The business case for survival and prosperity is widely recognized now, and probably more than ever than before. So we're in no doubt that organizations will have to change and improve. And in order for them to do that, they need to respect the current reality that we live in a constantly changing world. The rate of change is exponential, and the problems that we've experienced in the past are unlikely to be the same in the future. Our businesses must be able and agile to adapt to the changing environment within which we find ourselves. Businesses must continually adapt to transform, because the reality, if we do otherwise, will result in decline or worse. Now, as you can see, an organogram is a useful way of visualizing how a business is set up. And the unique features of the conventional view of a business, when it's visualized as an organogram, are essentially these: that managers manage teams, that there are distinct functional divisions, that the chain of command is clear, typically, and there are clear lines of authority. There is a clear line of communication and reporting, which is up and down, and usually then a clear description of responsibilities for each role. So they typically are the unique features that we see in an organogram. There is absolutely no question we need to be organized. It helps businesses establish order and it gets the work done. My question is, though, is that enough for today and tomorrow? Do organizations enable the agility, the capability, the adaptability necessary in order for business to transform? In other words, to sense the environment they're working in, interpret that environment, and respond effectively. So the challenge for many is this: what is the best method to choose in order to face into and resolve this challenge? And that's essentially the discussion for this afternoon. Now, I would add, of course, that as you look at the organogram, consider how a customer order would pass through this process. What would that look like? How chaotic might that be? And what might the customers experience if you consider the customer in the context of an organogram? So we're used to thinking about organizations in terms of their structure, the chain of command, who reports to whom, and so forth. And when we look at organizations, we see a very complex social as well as a technical system. You know, social in terms of our relationships, how we work together, how we feel about each other, and so forth, as well as the hard wiring, the technicality, the technical things that keep us together. Now, any organization is one interacting, interdependent system, typically within larger systems, either a small business within a bigger business, or a business within the community, within the world, and so forth. So essentially, we are not isolated. So if an organization is a system, and note the definition of a system, systems need hierarchy and structure. In other words, we need an organogram. Organizing people into groups by task and skill set, which is the visualization just been seen before, what I'm describing our functions, is probably the best theory available that we have today, and in itself doesn't conflict with our concept of system thinking. So systems and the organogram will sit complementary to each other. The problem that we have, and the problem we experience and we see, is when you organize people into groups, whatever the logic, the psychology is that they create their own purpose. We do things, whatever the purpose might be, however complementary or otherwise our individual purposes might be. And the second thing, of course, is we compete with other teams in that organogram. So I'm encouraging managers to appreciate systems and the importance of mastering systems in order to get the important daily work done, and recognize that the daily work is undertaken by everyone in your organization. There is no one who sits outside a process, and those processes make up the everyday stuff that we and our people do. So if we need to understand our current situation, and this was the situation with Dave, we need to understand our system. Now, the definition of a system serves us very well in describing our own experiences of how the work works in our business, and I want you to hold on to that. Of course, it is useful to remind ourselves that our customer has just one interest in what we do, and one alone, and that is, how does the work flow? In other words, how does my order proceed through your system, through your organization? So leading a system is uniquely different from managing an organogram, as we saw before, because what it's asking us to do is to understand variation, is to understand how we learn, develop, and improve, understand people and why they do what they do, why do they behave like they do, to understand the interdependencies and relationships that exist day in, day out. And finally, leading a system is about giving meaning, vision, direction, and focus to the organization as a whole. Now, there is an assumption there that we are getting that vision, direction, and focus from above, from our upper team, from our top managers. But what if we're not? What if we're Dave? So our contention is processes drive organizations. Everything we do is a process. So we appreciate that organizational charts serve us well in order for us to be organized and get things done. However, we appreciate that that in itself isn't sufficient. Processes are a critical asset like any other. And we often describe assets in our business as our people, correctly, as our machinery, correctly, and as our plant and infrastructure, correctly. But we don't often see processes described as critical assets. And I suppose I might ask you to reflect on why you think that might be. But because we believe processes are critical assets, they need to be owned and managed like any other. So as you're looking at your own organogram, and here is a typical organogram with the CEO, the members of the board or heads of functions, our middle management, and the in-process operators. In other words, those who are working in process where the work is done. So you may be able to describe and put names on those people, those individuals, but that's not always the case. Often, some of the people I work with have no idea who the head of function is, have no idea who the CEO is, and so forth. But that's maybe a discussion for another day. So business roles, system and process roles are interchangeable. So the hierarchical roles we've just seen also transfer over and are interchangeable with the business roles that we're used to. So the CEO, members of the board, heads of function, and so on are typically classified as system owners and process owners, whereas middle managers and in-process operators typically would be described as process managers and process operators. So seeing our business in this way and linking it with the system view that I showed you before, it enables us to ask different, potentially better and more insightful questions. So for example, who are we? What's the business that we are in? Which business are we not in? Where are we going? What are our priorities? What are our values and purpose? Now, my expectation is then, in order to answer those questions, our senior executives, our top team, if you will, and heads of, their accountabilities rest on working on the system. Working on the system. Whereas those who work at middle and lower levels, where the work is done, typically are working in the system. And when I am working in the system, what I am interested in is, what is my job? What is the best way to do my job? How, by what means will we improve? And how will we know how well we're doing? So what sort of feedback loops will we have in place? So you can see that those interrelationships, those dependencies don't go left or right. They go top to bottom too. So we've seen my apologies. If we're responding effectively to the questions that I've just posed, that requires investment in building those roles, the systems and the competency required, if we are to enable continual management and improvement of business processes, if we are describing them as critical. So DPM, daily process management, managing processes in the everyday, is an integral part of that approach. Now, we've seen firsthand on many occasions the positive impact such an investment in this area has had on staff. And I'll offer you Dave as an example, which gives them the insight and methods necessary to take control of their process performances and be successful. And this is not only radical process redesign, which is often what we talk about in project terms, but also in small scale incremental improvement. Daily process management is not a project, it is a way of work. And as a consequence of that, we need to reflect that. So the story I'm going to share with you will illustrate that point. It is about how we manage and continually improve the processes in the everyday as a way of working and not as a project, something that we dip in and out. It is the way we work. It's the way we do things around here. Now, the final element to this slide, therefore, is this, that if the CEO, board members, and heads of function work on the system, essentially my expectation is of them is that they set the strategy and they steer the improvement at the highest level. As you'll see later, there's an even more base expression that I'll use, but that for now is where we are. Whereas those who work in the system, middle managers, in-process operators, and so forth, their accountabilities are to standardize, maintain, and improve their everyday processes. And it is then that area that I'll be concentrating on. The last element, therefore, would be this, that in order to connect this, we need a top-down and bottom-up approach, something that I'm sure you have heard of in various areas in terms of Hoshinkanri, policy deployment, and so forth. But we need that bi-directional processes in order to ensure that the system is continually optimizing, it's transforming. So processes drive the organization in order for us to get control, stabilize, improve, and sustain. That is our baseline position. So looking in there more detail at the specific roles I've identified. Now, it may well be suggested that it would be career limiting for you to ask your CEO or your head of what exactly do they do. So I'm going to give you some prompts. And I want you to consider these 4 elements. So the 4 elements of a leader who's working systemically are these. Our expectations in order to ensure that we embed everyday process management in our culture as a way of working, how we do things, is for our top team to look outward, take a broad strategic approach to define the business aim, the strategy. The second element is our expectation is that they focus within on the systems and processes that are in place today to deliver that strategy. They also need to observe interactions within the system, ensuring that all of our work is optimized and not sub-optimized. And in its most basic form is my expectation is that a senior leader is concerned with how we play together. How do we work? What are those relationships? And so on and so forth. Observing interactions. And finally, then it's incumbent on our top team to review system performance so that we know how we're doing clearly and where it's required to make any necessary course adjustments. But that is based on feedback coming back from the system as well as their own feedback. So they are the 4 elements that our expectations would be. This is the thing. These are the things that we should see our top team doing. So let me propose this question to you, and we are interested clearly in your insights. So having said what I said, what is it like in your business? And I've given you those 4 options, essentially, answer 1, 2, 3, 4. So taking each of the 4 elements, please select those that apply. It may be none of them, it may be all of them, but we are interested in your feedback.
Okay, and on that note, I'm going to end that, and we'll see what's come up. So Baz, just before I do that, let's check your intention. What are you looking for by asking this question?
Well, I'm really looking for an assessment and understanding of how well how do we see the system within which we work. Irrespective of the level in which we do that, how holistic are our leadership processes, whereby we, in order to identify our ability and capability to transform, do we have all of those components in place? And my assertion would be that all 4 of these are required in order for us to set the direction based on our understanding of the environment within which we work, deploy that, and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So should we share those now and have a look, see what's come up? So hopefully those have appeared on screen, and we are aware that those on the live stream, Zoom doesn't broadcast these. So in question one, so we've got 1 and 4 have probably got kind of roughly 40% of respondents have put in, and then the one that had most responses on was question 2. Least is question 3. So Baz, bear in mind that these are not obviously the be all and end all of all questions and all states that could reflect. They're a selection from the from your observations you just described.
Yes.
Is this as you would expect it to be?
I think if Dave was sitting here, he might say yes. I think it is, and you're absolutely right, Rich, about drawing conclusions. But I suppose in broad terms, if we use the data as we see it here, there's almost a suggestion that we've got a one-way process. It's unidirectional, I think, is the sense I'm getting. And I'm absolutely intrigued with the third question. Yes. which is actually a manifestation of what I experience most often, is the quality of our interfaces, our relationships at those interfaces, and perhaps not even the quality of them, but a recognition of the need to consider them is very often something that I have to continue to work on.
Okay, great. So that sets the scene. We've heard much about Dave. I'm sure everyone's on everyone's on the edge of the seat. I've checked, and the real Dave is not in the attendance today, Barry. So you're safe.
Okay. Well, I think 1 or 2 of my clients might claim it's them, but that's not the case. if they feel better, that's fine by me.
Cheers, Barry.
Okay. So you're going to just take it off the screen now. Thanks, Rich. That's great. That's really interesting data. Okay. So. Welcome to Dave. Do you know, it was some years ago that I met this chap. Middle manager, medium-sized operation. He had roughly 150 reports with team leaders, supervisors, and then a significant proportion of operational staff. The business he was working in and he managed was part of a wider business system, but nonetheless, it was a critical hub to many other parts in the business, and also outside. So there was some criticality clearly in the services and so forth that he was operating. The type of business that he's operating that I'm referring to is irrelevant, and it's on this basis. Everything we do is a process. Everything Dave experienced almost certainly mirrors many others, irrespective of the sector or business. And I think for those who are operating in a consulting environment, who have the benefit of seeing a whole range of clients, actually, as the focus is on process, it doesn't really matter the area in which we're working. So let me tell you a little bit more about Dave. It's what we would call a scalded cat. He always gave me that impression that he was super fit because he's moving from one meeting to another. And absolutely what he was doing was moving from one calamity to another, always in a hurry, always busy, or he was very busy, but one or other. So I could preempt pretty much what it was he was going to say when I asked him how he was. The bigger business itself, I'm afraid to say, I would describe it as being managed by organogram. So there was absolutely no sense of systems or process thinking. So as a consequence of that, there was a deep aversion to anyone, and Dave in particular, to step out of the shadows to try something new, because it wasn't particularly pleasant when the last person did it. And we haven't forgotten that. So the business itself often collapsed in on itself. Everyone appeared to be chasing things, chasing stuff. And the last crisis has been overtaken by the latest crisis. And you know what struck me? It was actually very difficult to see who is the boss here and who are the workers. Problems were dealt with, but there was always a deep unease that the problem remained deep in the undergrowth and it could return at any time. So Dave was frequently surprised and often more frequently disappointed, let down, because the other parts of the system were working on their own chaos, doing their best to resolve their problems. So they had very little time for him. And there is no doubt that dynamic extended higher up into the organization. I'm convinced of that. So Dave did everything that he was asked to do: audits, appraisals, investigations, CapEx requests, hosting visits, anything and everything. He was actually never quite sure why he did all of this, but he did it diligently nonetheless. So he had ambitions for his business, but they frankly weren't well formed, nor did anyone actually ask him to share his thoughts. I think deep down, he felt his business was unloved, and that's perhaps borne by the reality that no one ever came to see him. However, he did get lots of calls, and many were not particularly pleasant. But one day, someone at a senior level was sufficiently inspired to consider the concept of process management. And that was as a way forward for the company. I'm not entirely sure why. Perhaps it was profitability issues, the rapidly changing market they were in, survival. Someone else is doing it, so we better start doing it ourselves type idea. So I was imposed on Dave. He didn't ask for me. He didn't go looking for me. I was imposed. And always courteous and polite, whenever Dave imagined his help, whatever he imagined his help in his current situation, it wasn't sitting in front of him on our very first day. And I imagined the words were forming in his head as we talked. This on top of my day job, just what I need. So we laughed about this later on, but to be perfectly honest, not on the day that we first met, I have to say. So that's Dave. And as you can see, the ideal world that I've prepared for you before actually looked like this, that everyone was working in the system. The system collapsed in on itself whilst we all resolved the latest crisis. It was a fog, and they were getting lost in fog. And that's where the process and the business settled, lost in fog. Now, this visualization you see on the screen, some of you will have seen this before if you've worked with me and other colleagues. This visualization of an everyday process absolutely intrigued Dave. He quickly learned that processes inevitably decay over time if they are left unattended. So on the screen here, you'll see on the x-axis is over time, and on the y-axis performance deteriorating. And Dave felt that, he knew it, he couldn't articulate it, it just seemed like the world that he was in. He didn't know why the process would decay over time, although he had some theories. But this chart actually helped lift some of the fog that enveloped him. What he could see was that his busyness, the busyness was a symptom of something more endemic, more systemic, and the dawning realization that it was the heroics by him and his team that actually delivered the outcomes they achieved. So processes that they operated day in, day out were permanently in a state of chaos, and it was through the efforts of his people and him that at least got them the outcomes that they could be satisfied with, but they were never entirely satisfied. So working in the system and our best efforts and hard work will not suffice. And as you can see the quote from Deming, the best intentions of our people can ruin companies. We won't get improvements in performance, a greater efficiency, or increased productivity if we simply urge our people to do their best, work harder, shout louder. And I'm afraid putting up bigger posters, sending longer emails, inducing greater stress is not leadership, nor will it result in improvement. If we compromise our systems and processes, and sadly that's what's happening or was happening, we won't deliver improvements in efficiency or productivity either. Any short-term gain that we might see actually often leads to long-term chaos. And probably because rather than improving the process, we're actually tampering with the process. So this is the very place Dave found himself in, and yet the work got done. But the question we need to ask is by what means and at what cost? And when things inevitably go wrong, what values, principles, and priorities did Dave lean on in order to help him? So as you can see, we need a theory of management for optimization of the system. and Dave and his team work in a system. So he and I worked on an approach that we'd focus on the work that happened day in, day out, not in a project sense, but simply working on how does the work in our business, and how do we get control? How do we stabilize the current situation? And so we worked on an approach which is called daily process management in order to move from chaos to stability, and ultimately, I'm delighted to say, improvement and sustainability. So we need a theory of management. So how are we going to stop that slide, the inexorable drift downwards? So Dave didn't need design for Six Sigma, nor did he need Six Sigma, nor did he need TPM. Well, certainly not immediately anyway. What he needed to do was to believe that doing the same thing the same way every time wouldn't magically free him from the tyranny and chaos that held him in its grip. But also just doing stuff wouldn't work either. So random walking and random working activities wouldn't make his business better. So Dave was sufficiently intrigued and inspired, and I hope trusting, to take the risk of stepping out from the cultural norm by thinking and doing things differently. And maybe at some point he did see me as help after all, but I didn't really ask him that question. Maybe I should have done. So making Dave's business better would focus on how the work worked in the everyday, and specifically in the everyday core processes across each function, underpinning this approach with the principle and tools that could make his business better. And that is the approach that we promote in terms of daily process management, is the approach of standardization, maintenance, and improvement, DPM. So back to the original view in terms of the business roles and process roles, and now look at the additional accountabilities and the specifics that a business that is embedding DPM and establishing a culture of everyday excellence essentially would be operating these processes. So we can still see the hierarchy within our organogram, and we can still see the process hierarchy too. So if you have the chance to have a discussion with the most senior person in the business, my expectation is if you did get to ask them the question and it wasn't too career limiting, what exactly do you do? It might be useful then to listen to the responses. The accountability of the system owner is to define the business aim and strategy. They should know the business system and its health, and they should also create strategic goals. Those at head of function level, the most senior people beneath the CEO, should link the strategic goals with the key business processes, the processes that Dave was operating day in, day out. They should make sure that people know their role and have the capability to do that. Well, in fairness to this organization, they saw that, hence why I was with Dave. And also then is now that we've begun to do something to review process performance in order to inform the strategy. So it's bidirectional and not unidirectional, which of course many of your responses in the first poll were inferring. So what is it that Dave then should be doing? Well, Dave, in this new world of daily process management, the requirements of him would be to learn how the process works, monitor process performance, and respond appropriately to abnormality if and when it arises, I should say. And also, within that, is to define and redefine how the process should work, in other words, to the best known way. Now, Dave could also empower his own people, those who operated the processes, team leaders, supervisor, and operators, so that they operate and monitor the standardized process, respond to abnormalities appropriately, and they would engage and deliver small-scale process improvements, not as a project, but just in the everyday, the recognition of small-scale incremental improvement. And as a consequence of that, as Dave and his team acquired more knowledge and insight and data, he was able to present that back to the senior people, or should be able to present that back to senior people, so that they could interpret, and respond appropriately. And that may well be some course adjustment, some strategic change. So this may well be the defining slide for you in terms of, so what are those key accountabilities at each level of the hierarchy? So Rich, second poll.
So Baz has put this in just to get a sense of how's this story resonating and how does this relate with the audience. So again, as we mentioned earlier on, this is a two-part webinar series. So next week's webinar, Barry's also presenting. We're going to take some of the input from here and reflect and feature that in there. There's a challenge for you, Barry. I've just set you the opportunity to write your webinar there.
It's not like me, Rich, to do that.
Certainly not. Okay, just 4 more seconds on that, and
okay.
I'll close the polling. And there we go. Okay, so what have we got? We've got a lot of Daves in the room here, Barry.
I think there's a lot of Daves in the room. Well, you know, that maybe that was a theory, but I suppose the benefit of these polls also is absolutely the insights that we can gain, you know, as PMI, but also in each individual asking themselves the question. So having just listened to Dave's story, is that me? How much of that resonates with my current situation? And frankly, we encounter it a lot. Clearly, we engage with clients when there are problems, so perhaps that's not unusual and should not be a surprise. But I'm not being sure, of course, is also perfectly valid. I'd like to develop that further then in the second week, but clearly that's been useful data.
Okay, cheers, Baz.
Okay, so now let's moving on. Now that you know a little bit about Dave, so the approach itself, then, that made the difference. So we've seen the ideal. So we've looked at the context using Dave as an example, and clearly it resonates with a good proportion of you. So what is the approach then that made the difference? This DPM, and as you can see the graphic here, it's about standardization, maintenance, and improvement. But even as that's described, I think the recognition that there's a stage before the process of standardization, if you will, and that is the one of stabilizing, this getting control. Now, the journey of process management and continuous improvement, it often starts, as I've just illustrated here, with a deteriorating process, and I've given you the scenario in some detail now. The first step, therefore, in order to get control, is to standardize the process. I'm sure many of you have said and have heard that before we begin to consider improvement of a process, we should first enable the process to be standardized. And clearly we would be advocating that approach. So we need to discover and rediscover the best known way of operating the process and getting everyone's commitment to work in that way. So one of the accountabilities clearly with our operators is that they do assume that accountability. So standardization, at the very least, is the first opportunity for us to begin to staunch the flow, is to get some element of control. And frankly, in many cases, our customer may well appreciate that standardization has reduced the variation in the process as well. So we can get that as a consequence. The next stage then that we would take Dave through is the process of maintaining the process standards and therefore performance. So we need to adopt monitoring systems. So a significant, in terms of visual management, quite a basic, but nonetheless a profound introduction of a visual management system made significant difference in order for Dave and his team to detect abnormality, that tracking performance as they arose. Because as I said to you before, Dave was often disappointed. There were too many surprises. He found out too late. The disaster had happened. And therefore, we needed to get ahead of the game. We needed to predict rather than respond to and have to recover. So the other element, of course, was the requirement to visualize the important information about the process. So it was made very visual, very public, very clear in real time in order to support rapid problem resolution and so forth. The continuous improvement elements then is what we described as this relentless hunt to eliminate waste in his business, but not just to strip out waste, but also duplication and inconsistencies every day. but one of the most profound changes in his organization was the recognition that the interdependencies and the relationships needed to be worked on, and for more explicit manifestation of the customer-supply relationship than was heretofore. And as a consequence of that, the first improvements was this recognition that in process terms, this customer-supply relationship would make that difference, and was also very explicit. So we would consider then that the first stage, getting that process under control, managed by the local process team, and remember this is an iterative process, it's continuous, enabled Dave then to begin to think of potentially the longer term ambition. And in order for him to consider some of the longer term, more radical improvements, he was now in a position where he could engage in and deploy a much more sophisticated radical redesign process, such as our improvement cycle that you can see here. So he was perfectly capable then of reaching out to those who had expertise at a more sophisticated improvement level that could support him to get step change improvement. So if you can imagine, if I'm a green belt or a black belt and I'm being commissioned by a business area that already has this approach in place, how much more fertile, and the likelihood of success I would suggest is that much greater. Now, for a green belt or black belt who has been commissioned for radical improvement, there's also this opportunity then to reinsert, to reinvest that improved process back into Dave's arena, and this is essentially what we were looking to do. So therefore, there would be a newly improved, standardized process, which is handed back to the local process team. So collaboration end to end, data rich, and clearly then people with the capability to be able to support that much more radical improvement process. So some thoughts then that inspired Dave, and I'm repeating my point and I'm emphasizing the point that processes are critical assets, and the ingredients in any process will all follow the same pattern. We will still be looking at the same inputs: people, material, machine, method, and environment. Okay, and the definition, therefore, of a process is our ability to transform the range of inputs into an output for which we have a customer. So in order to do that transformation and to satisfy the customer, these are the things that Dave needed that needed to be clear about. What would good look like? So if processes are critical assets, the people element of that, what would that need to look like? Well, his people needed to understand the customer and their needs, and that could just be the next step in the process as well as the consumer. They also needed to have process knowledge and the skill to do the work. So challenging his people was met in equal measure by support in order for them to build that capability. The material that was provided to him needed to be of sufficient quality, quantity, and of course the timeliness to meet the needs. So he was able then to form alliances with his supply chain in order for him to be explicit about what he needed for his processes to operate effectively and efficiently. The machinery he had at his disposal needed to be capable to support the delivery of the work activities to the right quality, speed, efficiency, and so forth. The method that would be deployed by the people in the process would be the best known way to achieve all process demands. And then the last bit, of course, is the environment within which Dave and his people were working needed to be optimized to aid the work, and that the culture itself, the culture in his area, in his business, was conducive to get the best possible outcome. Now, he recognized that as he continued to work on this, the potential outcomes were worthwhile seeking. And he talked to me about these particular elements, that my people are able to do their best work in the most productive and consistent way possible. And as a consequence of that, it leads to your customer being satisfied and others in your business system, for perhaps up to higher levels, at lower cost. So as a consequence of doing these things, this is what he appreciated. Unfortunately, the downside just doesn't need to be considered. inferior outputs, slow response time, poor productivity and utilization of assets. And sadly, when Dave saw this slide, he saw the red bit and thought, I can't go back to that nightmare, because that's essentially where he had been. So it's an extremely powerful slide to context where he was to where he was now going. So these are the key things then that we did. And this is now leading us into the second webinar of next week. In this order, map the key processes. We need to understand, how does the work? How does the work flow? We need to identify and agree the key interface conditions to be met, what I call pre-flight conditions. What are the conditions operations need from planning in order for operations to get off to the best possible start? That was also the case with the shifts. So between morning, afternoon, and evening shift would also have the same conditions. Quite a profound exercise was one that was considered to be a paper exercise, turned out to be extremely powerful. And this is mapping the day in the life of. So typically, in order to get some control and rigor and discipline, the principle of hourly, daily, weekly, monthly diaries became very important then, in order for not just Dave, but Dave and his team and the bigger system to be able to work efficiently and effectively. Identification of the key things that Dave and his team needed to keep focus on, not the thousands and thousands of things that essentially were the noise that he was being distracted by. And at the same time then, the key measures that best informed him of process performance. He was drowning in measures, none of which were of any use to him, but actually someone else apparently required them, but he never actually knew why or who. The ability to detect and resolve problems before they became a crisis. And then finally, the glue that keeps this together was timed, rigorous daily, weekly, monthly reviews, pitched at the right level and led well. So again, metronomic, disciplined, rigorous. And the culture that sat behind this then was this constancy of purpose. Dave had stepped across the line. He recognized that this is the right thing to do, and therefore he continued to do that. So there was a great consistency. It's not to say he wasn't surprised occasionally, nor was he disappointed, but fundamentally then he was getting control, and he was now being able to direct and dictate. So over time then, this fog lifted. And these are the four things that Dave described to me as in terms of how he could see the future crystallizing. That irrespective of which business area you worked in, the business in general, the big business, everyone at every level would understand the work they do and where it fits into the overall business system. Understanding the needs of the customer, whether it's the consumer or the next person. And fundamentally, we know which direction we're going in. Everyone can operate, measure, and improve their processes in real time, whether you're in finance, in procurement, in sales, in HR, in operations. And finally, then this bit, that doing the everyday work and improving it is seen as everyone's job. Everyone's job. It's natural. And I'm talking from top to bottom and bottom to top. So Dave then was in this position. He had learned the processes. He'd monitored and defined. His operators were operating and monitoring the standardized processes. And then he was in a position then to present data upwards. So what Dave could now offer his business, and he was confident to be able to do that, is a method that worked, is a method that had universal application, and it was delivering the results. So what was interesting about Dave then is that he went on to welcome, actually he encouraged visitors to his business so that he could share his insights. He often talked to me about the process of talking to visitors was him talking to himself, which helped him appreciate how far he had moved forward. Not just him, but his business and his people. You know, he said to me that this stuff is hard, but perhaps the hardest bit was making the decision to call a stop, that there has to be a better way. And I was interesting too that he said, when you begin to achieve, there's no better feeling. So for him, it had a profound effect, a profound positive effect, not just on his business, but on himself and his family. And he described to me that dynamic as well. So in control, making progress, Very few surprises now, occasionally disappointed, but that's life. So as you can see, Dave was left in a position where he now had met the ceiling. Tactically, I've gotten control of my processes. And he then reached out to his bosses and their bosses in order to tell me, where are my processes going? Where do I need to be 1, 3, 5 years? Which was completely heard of, perhaps months and years before. Okay, so he was then reporting up. And as a consequence of that, the business was then look at how can we engage and encourage and continue to support this process. So in summary then, top management work on the system and your people work in the system. So leadership isn't a role. We should all assume leadership when we see it, when we see where we see we must. I mean, Dave would perhaps perfectly acceptable for him to have done nothing other than to continue doing what he did, but he felt he filled that void. So anyone, everyone at any level can assume leadership where we see it. We need to stabilize in order to standardize, maintain, and improve. So the methodology I've just described, SMI, it's the foundation approach that can underpin all other approaches. And finally, I'll leave with this thought. If the flow of the work is critical to the customer, and it is, then it must also be critical to you. So next week, I'll continue Dave's story. I'll look at the approach in greater detail, the tools and techniques that enable him achieve the benefits that he did. But that's next week. For now, thank you.
On behalf of SoftExpert, thank you for the presence of everyone who participated in this event. If you have any questions, please contact the presenter via email. To see other webinars, ebooks, and white papers on the subject, please visit our website at www.softexpert.com. Find out more about SoftExpert solutions for business compliance, innovation, and digital transformation. Thanks for listening. See you next time.